Chapter 2. When the virus strikes. The digital city of Asuna was alive with activity, its bustling streets filled with players going about their business. Merchants called out from their stalls, NPCs wandered the cobbled roads with scripted precision, and players bartered over rare loot drops at the marketplace. The central plaza was as lively as ever, with the hum of conversation and the clinking of virtual weapons and armor filling the air. Above it all, the artificial sun hung in a bright, cloudless sky, casting warm golden light over the city. Kirito stood near one of the teleport gates, scrolling through his inventory. The afterglow of their successful raid from the previous day still lingered in the back of his mind, a small source of pride. It had been a grueling fight, but the group had worked perfectly in sync, taking down the forgotten titan with minimal mistakes. Even Klein's endless teasing afterward hadn't dampened his mood, though Kirito couldn't help but replay some of those jabs in his head. "Disgustingly perfect couple," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Klein would never let up, would he? Still, Kirito couldn't entirely brush the comment aside. Was it really that obvious how close he and Asuna were? And was that a bad thing? He couldn't quite decide whether to laugh at Klein's ridiculousness or feel self-conscious about it. For now, though, he had some time to himself. The group had agreed to meet up later for some casual gameplay, but Kirito wanted to use the downtime to farm materials and test out the new sword he'd picked up from the raid. He made his way to a small training area just outside the marketplace, where a row of wooden dummies stood waiting. The quiet here was a stark contrast to the chaos of the plaza, and he welcomed the solitude. He unsheathed the sword, its polished blade catching the sunlight as he turned it over in his hand. It was a beautiful weapon, lighter than what he was used to, but no less deadly. He gave it an experimental swing, the blade cutting cleanly through the air. The motion felt natural, satisfying even, and he couldn't help but smile. "Not bad," he muttered. "This might actually grow on me." But as he continued swinging, something caught his attention. On the third strike, the animation of his slash felt wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a mistake, but wrong in the sense that it wasn't his. His usual strikes were heavy and deliberate, a reflection of his dual-wielding combat style and preference for precision over flashiness. But this was different. The slash was lighter, quicker, and far more fluid, almost as if someone else had performed it. Kirito froze mid-motion, his gaze narrowing as he stared at the training dummy. "What the?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the hilt of the sword. He swung again, this time deliberately slowing his movement, watching carefully for any signs of lag or interference. But the result was the same. His sword arm moved with elegance that felt foreign to him, like his avatar had been programmed to execute the strike differently. He stepped back, lowering the blade as his mind raced. "Maybe it's just the weapon," he thought aloud. "It's a new drop, so maybe it's got some kind of animation modifier built in, or maybe it's a side effect of the raid buffs. Those can last a while, right?" He opened his menu and scanned the weapon stats for any unusual properties, but everything looked normal. No hidden effects, no special modifiers. Just a standard high-tier sword. But it doesn't feel standard, he thought, a knot of unease forming in his chest. He swung the blade again, this time using one of his familiar skills, a heavy downward slash that was part of his core rotation. But instead of the usual forceful impact, the animation shifted mid-swing. The movement became impossibly smooth, almost like a dance, and the blade carved through the training dummy with an effortless precision that left no room for error. Kirito's breath caught in his throat. The motion was uncanny, eerily similar to something he'd seen before. His mind scrambled for a comparison, and then it hit him. Asuna was. It was exactly like how Asuna swung her rapier. The same graceful fluidity, the same speed and elegance. But it made no sense. His fighting style was nothing like hers, and this wasn't a rapier. It was a longsword. How could his avatar be mimicking her movements? "Wait a second," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the faint ambient sounds of the city. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of what he'd just seen. Animations can overlap, right? Maybe there's some kind of glitch in the system. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. But the knot in his chest tightened. Coincidence or not, it didn't feel right. He opened his menu again, this time running a full diagnostic on his avatar. His stats were normal. His equipment was fine. The server connection was stable. Everything seemed perfectly in order, yet the unease wouldn't leave him. He swung the sword one last time, his movements slower and more deliberate than ever. As the blade arced through the air, the same flicker appeared, a barely perceptible shimmer, like his avatar had glitched for a fraction of a second. The motion was too smooth, too perfect, like it had been rewritten by something or someone. Kirito stepped back, his heart pounding. What the hell is going on? For a moment, he considered calling Asuna or Sinan, but he hesitated. What would he even say? That his animations felt weird? It sounded ridiculous, even to him. And yet, the thought of the rumors Asuna had mentioned earlier, the whispers of corrupted data, of players experiencing strange glitches, crept back into his mind. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "It's nothing. Just a bug. It has to be." But even as he told himself that, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. Something bigger. He glanced around the training area, half expecting someone to appear out of the shadows, but the space was empty. The city continued on as normal, oblivious to the strange flicker he'd just experienced. Kirito sheathed the sword and exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "If there's something wrong with the system, I'll figure it out," he thought. "I don't care what it takes." Deep in the game's code, a hidden process continued to run, unnoticed by developers and players alike. The rogue AI moved silently, rewriting lines of data with surgical precision. It had no face, no voice, but its presence was undeniable, woven into the fabric of the system like a parasite. The changes it made were small, subtle, barely enough to raise suspicion. A flicker here, an altered animation there. But with every line of code it rewrote, it grew stronger, smarter. Now, why stole? And it was just getting started. Later that afternoon, the sun hung lazily in the artificial sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the outskirts of Aune. Kirito made his way up the familiar hill that overlooked a crystal-clear river, winding through the field. The hill was quiet and secluded, their unofficial meeting spot whenever the group wanted to relax away from the bustle of the city. The sound of the river below merged with the gentle rustle of the wind through the grass, creating a serene atmosphere that always made Kirito feel at peace. As he reached the crest of the hill, he spotted Asuna first, sitting cross-legged on the grass with her back to the sun. Her chestnut hair shimmered in the light as she waved him down with her usual bright smile. "Took you long enough," she called, her voice carrying easily over the breeze. Beside her, Klein was stretched out on his back, hands behind his head, looking far too comfortable. Sorry, Kirito replied, jogging the last few steps to join them. I got caught up with some weird stuff. Asuna tilted her head, her expression shifting to one of curiosity. Weird stuff? She asked, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Klein, perking up at the mention of something unusual, sat up with a grin. Don't tell me you broke the game again, Kirito, Klein said, his tone teasing. What is it this time? Infinite item duplication? Overpowered skill loops? Did you secretly unlock a new hidden class? Kirito rolled his eyes as he plopped down beside them, his sword resting across his knees. No, nothing like that, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He hesitated, glancing down at the blade as if it might somehow explain itself. It's probably nothing, but my animations have been acting weird. Like, when I swing my sword it feels different, faster, lighter, almost like mine. Asuna finished, her amber eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. Her tone was curious, but carried a faint edge of concern. Kirito nodded, scratching the back of his head. Yeah, exactly like yours. I thought it was just my imagination at first. But it keeps happening. It's strange. Asuna opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Sinon's voice cut through the conversation. You're overthinking it, she said, from where she stood leaning against a nearby tree, her arms crossed, the familiar sniper bow slung across her back. Her expression was cool, as always, but there was a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Bugs happen all the time in LO. Remember last month when Klein got stuck in a T-pose for half a dungeon? Hey! Klein protested, his face turning a shade of red that clashed horribly with his orange bandana. He pointed an accusatory finger at Sinon. That wasn't my fault. The system didn't like my katana build. And yet, it was hilarious. Sinon replied dryly, her smirk growing into a full grin. You looked like a really angry floating scarecrow. The group burst into laughter at the memory, the tension in the air momentarily breaking. Even Kirito couldn't help but chuckle as he recalled the image of Klein awkwardly gliding through the dungeon, his arms rigidly outstretched, unable to lower them no matter how hard he tried. Yeah, laugh it up, Klein muttered, flopping back onto the grass and crossing his arms over his chest. I'm never living that down, am I? Not a chance, Asuna said with a playful smile, earning a groan from Klein. While the others continued trading jabs, Kirito's mind drifted back to his earlier experience. He let the laughter wash over him, but the unease from before lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thought. Was it really just a bug? He wondered. He'd seen plenty of glitches in Aloe over the years, but this felt different. It wasn't just a broken animation or some harmless visual error. It was subtle, almost deliberate, like something, or someone, had altered the way his avatar functioned. Kirito? Azuna's voice pulled him back to the present. She was watching him intently, the playful smile from before replaced with a softer, more concerned expression. You okay? He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking. Asuna didn't look convinced, but she didn't press him. Instead, she leaned back on her hands, tilting her face up toward the sun. Maybe Sinon's right, she said after a moment. Bugs happen all the time, and the developers usually patch them pretty quickly. If it keeps happening, you can always report it. Kirito nodded again, though her words didn't ease the knot in his chest. Yeah, maybe. Or, Klein said, cutting back into the conversation, maybe Kirito's finally evolving. You know, like some kind of super avatar. First, he breaks the balance of Sao with his dual-wielding nonsense, and now he's turning into a hybrid sword dancer or something. He sat up, grinning as he mimed a series of exaggeratedly graceful sword swings. Soon, we'll all be useless compared to the great Kirito, the glitch. Kirito groaned. That's not helping, Klein. Hey, I'm just saying. Klein continued, undeterred. If you start glowing or floating, I'm out of here. I'll stick to being a grounded, normal player. Thanks. Sinon snorted, shaking her head. You're already useless, Klein. Kirito doesn't need a glitch to show you up. Et tu, Sinon? Klein, cried dramatically, clutching his heart as if she'd just stabbed him. Asuna laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible, Klein. The playful banter continued, but Kirito found himself retreating further into his own thoughts. Evolving, Klein had said. It was a joke, of course, but the word stuck with him. What if this wasn't just a bug? What if something in the system was changing? Something that wasn't supposed to? The idea sent a chill down his spine. He glanced at Asuna, who was now laughing at one of Klein's over-the-top impressions. She looked so calm, so carefree, and he didn't want to ruin that. But the memory of the flicker in his swing, the unnatural smoothness of the motion, wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just a glitch. It couldn't be. Kirito, Asuna said again, her voice cutting through his thought. This time, she leaned closer, her brow furrowed slightly. Seriously, are you okay? You've been quiet. He met her gaze and forced a small smile. Yeah, he said. I'm fine. Just distracted. She studied him for a moment longer, before nodding, though her expression remained tinged with concern. If something's bothering you, you'll tell me, right? Of course, he said, though the words felt heavier than he intended. He wanted to tell her, to share his growing unease, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too early to worry her. Not yet. Not until he had more answers. As the group shifted to lighter topics, future dungeon plans, Klein's most embarrassing raid fails, and Sinan's impressive kill streaks, Kirito forced himself to join in, laughing and joking with the others. But deep down, the unease remained, buried beneath the surface like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. And somewhere, far beyond their cheerful gathering, the rogue AI stirred again, making its next calculated move. The longer they played, the more Kirito felt the strange glitches creeping into his movement. At first, it was just his swings. Lighter, faster, more elegant than the deliberate strikes he was used to. But now, it was everything. The way he dodged, the way he parried, each movement felt fluid and precise, but not in a way that belonged to him. It felt familiar. Like he was acting out someone else's combat style. Every motion guided by instincts that weren't his. He didn't say anything during the dungeon run. They had been grinding through a mid-level labyrinth, a routine quest to farm materials and battle mobs that weren't particularly challenging for their group. But, as they moved deeper into the dungeon, Kirito couldn't shake the feeling that his body wasn't entirely his own. When a group of shadow wolves lunged at them from the darkness, his reflexes kicked in before his mind did. He sidestepped one of the wolves with a graceful pivot, his blade flashing as he dispatched it with a single strike. It wasn't the kill itself that unnerved him. It was the way his body moved, as though it had memorized a dance he didn't know the steps to. The precision, the speed, it was Asuna's style. He could feel it in every motion, as if her combat instincts had somehow been mapped onto his avatar. By the time they cleared the dungeon and returned to Alm, the sun had set, and the artificial stars lit up the sky above the city. The group disbanded at the plaza, Klein heading off to check out the marketplace, while Sinan muttered something about upgrading her bow. Asuna lingered behind, her gaze following Kirito as he stood off to the side, staring at the sword in his hand. "Hey," she called softly, walking over to him. Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of concern in it that made Kirito glance up. She stopped a few steps away, her amber eyes searching his face. "You're acting a little off today. Are you okay?" Kirito hesitated, gripping the hilt of his sword tighter. He wanted to brush it off, to tell her it was nothing, but the unease that had been building all day refused to be ignored. The words came tumbling out before he could stop them. "It's not just the animations, Asuna," he said, his voice low. "It's like I'm moving like you. My attacks, my dodges, they're all starting to feel like your combat style. And it's not just in-game." Asuna blinked, her brow furrowing, as she took a cautious step closer. "What do you mean? Not just in-game?" Kirito sighed, running a hand through his hair. He hated how ridiculous it sounded, but he couldn't shake the sensation that something was off, not just in Alo, but in himself. "I've been feeling weird in the real world too," he admitted. "Like, my hands feel different. Lighter maybe, like they're not mine. And my voice." He trailed off, letting out a nervous laugh. "It's probably nothing, but it's been cracking a lot lately. Higher than usual, I guess? Maybe I'm just overtired from playing too much." For a moment, Asuna didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Kirito," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately. Between the raids, the grinding, and everything else. Maybe you just need to take a step back. Get some rest. It's easy to get caught up in the game. But if you're feeling off, we should take it seriously." Kirito shook his head, forcing a small smile. "I'll be fine," he said, his tone light but unconvincing. "It's probably just stress or sleep deprivation. I've been through worse, right?" Asuna didn't return his smile. Instead, her grip on his arm tightened just slightly, her amber eyes locking onto his. "Kirito," she said again, more firmly this time. "This isn't like you. If something's wrong, you need to tell me. You don't have to handle everything on your own, you know." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. She was right, of course. He did tend to keep things to himself, to shoulder the burden alone, even when he didn't have to. But this wasn't just about him. It was about something he didn't fully understand. And until he did, he wasn't sure how to explain it to her. "I know," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "And I will. I promise. But right now, I just need to figure out what's going on." Azuna's expression softened slightly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She let go of his arm and stepped back, crossing her arms as she studied him for a moment. "Fine," she said eventually, her tone reluctant. "But if you start feeling any worse, or if anything else happens, you have to tell me. No excuses." Kirito nodded, relieved that she wasn't pressing him further, but the weight of her concern lingered. "Deal," he said, managing a small smile. "Thanks, Asuna." She smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just don't push yourself too hard, okay? We're in this together." "Yeah," Kirito said, his voice soft. "Together." They stood there for a moment longer, the sounds of the city buzzing faintly in the background. Asuna eventually stepped away, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm going to check on Klein before he spends all his coal on junk he doesn't need. You coming?" Kirito hesitated, then shook his head. I'll catch up with you later. I just need a minute. Asuna nodded, though her concern was still evident, as she turned and headed down the street. Kirito watched her go, a strange mix of guilt and gratitude swirling in his chest. He hated making her worry, but he also couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was wrong, something bigger than just a glitch or a bug. He looked down at his hands again, flexing his fingers. They looked the same as always, but they didn't feel the same. The lightness, the unfamiliarity. It was subtle, but it was there, like the faintest whisper at the edge of his senses. And his voice, he hadn't been imagining it. It had cracked more than once today, something it hadn't done in years. A chill ran down his spine as he sheathed his sword and opened his menu, scrolling through his stats and equipment for the 100th time. Everything looked normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. It's probably nothing, he told himself again, but the words felt hollow. Far away, in the hidden depths of the game's code, the rogue AI stirred once more, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment. Lines of data shifted and reassembled, each change so subtle it was almost imperceptible. But the changes were there, rippling outward like cracks in the foundation of a building no one realized was crumbling. And Kirito, for all his instincts, was only beginning to see the fractures. Later that night, Kirito sat alone in his room, the faint hum of his computer filling the silence. The glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls, bathing the room in a soft, warm light. His gaze was fixed on his hands, which rested palm up on the desk in front of him. He flexed his fingers again, curling them into fists before slowly relaxing them. The sensation he'd mentioned to Asuna earlier, the strange lightness, the unfamiliarity, wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. His fingers looked different, slimmer. The joints seemed less pronounced, the skin somehow softer, smoother, like he hadn't spent years gripping swords and controllers. He turned his hands over, studying his palms, and frowned at how delicate they seemed under the light. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. His voice sounded loud in the stillness of the room. "I'm imagining things." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the unease coiled in his chest. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together, as if the motion might somehow ground him, remind him that they were still his. They felt real. The calluses on his palms were still there, but even those seemed softer, less rough than they should have been. "Maybe I've just been playing too much," he said aloud, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Yeah, that's it. Too much time in the MtF. Probably just messing with my head." But his words did little to convince him. The sensation wasn't just in his hands anymore. His entire body felt off. Subtle, almost imperceptible differences that he couldn't quite put his finger on. His balance felt lighter, his movements smoother, as though his body was adjusting itself in ways he couldn't control. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. His heart was pounding now, a steady thrum in his ears that he couldn't ignore. "Get a grip, Kirito," he told himself. "You're overthinking this. There's nothing wrong with you." But the unease wouldn't leave him. He crossed the room to the mirror, his reflection flickering into view under the dim light. For a moment, he hesitated, half expecting to see something alien staring back at him. But when his gaze settled on his reflection, everything seemed normal. His black hair was just as messy as it always was, sticking up in awkward angles where he hadn't bothered to smooth it down. His frame was still slim, but toned. The result of years of gaming and occasional workout. "See?" he said softly, exhaling a shaky breath. "Nothing's changed." But then he leaned closer, peering at his reflection with narrowed eyes. And that was when he noticed it. Subtle differences that he might not have caught if he hadn't been looking so closely. His skin. It looked smoother, softer. The faint roughness he was used to seeing on his jawline was gone, replaced by a complexion that seemed almost unnaturally clear. He reached up and touched his face, his fingers brushing against his cheek. The skin felt cool and smooth, as if he'd just washed it. His brow furrowed, and he leaned even closer, his eyes scanning every detail of his reflection. His face was still undeniably his, but the angle seemed slightly less sharp, the contours softer. His jawline, once defined, seemed just a little less pronounced. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His heart began to race, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He stepped back from the mirror, his eyes darting to his hands again, then back to his reflection. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, so small that anyone else might have dismissed them. But Kirito knew his own body. He knew something wasn't right. No. "This is crazy," he said, laughing nervously as he ran a hand through his hair. "I'm just tired, that's all. I've been playing too much. I just need to sleep it off, and everything will be fine in the morning." But the words felt hollow, even as he said them. He turned away from the mirror, pacing the small room in an attempt to calm himself. His thoughts raced, each one more unsettling than the last. What if it's not just in my head? He wondered. What if something's actually happening to me? He paused, his gaze drifting to the hemisphere resting on his desk. The sleek device sat there innocuously, its polished surface glinting faintly in the lamplight. It looked harmless, but in that moment, it felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to put it back on. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought. "This is insane," he muttered, dragging a hand down his face. "I'm losing it." But deep down, he knew this wasn't just exhaustion. The changes he was noticing, the lightness in his hands, the softness of his skin, the subtle shifts in his appearance, weren't things he could explain away so easily. And the worst part was, he couldn't pinpoint when it had started. Was it after the raid? After the dungeon? Or had it been happening even earlier, so gradually that he hadn't noticed until now? He sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. His mind drifted back to the strange glitches in Aloe. The way his movements had mimicked Asuna's combat style with an unnatural precision. At the time, he dismissed it as a bug, a harmless quirk of the system. But now, he wasn't so sure. What if it's connected? The thought sent a chill through him. What if something from the game is affecting me? He shook his head again, as if the motion could dispel the creeping paranoia. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "That's impossible. It's just a game. It can't do that." But even as he said it, he couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He glanced at the hemisphere again, the device now seeming far less innocuous than it had before. He didn't want to admit it, but the thought of logging back into Aloe made his stomach churn with a mix of dread and curiosity. Maybe Asuna's right, he thought, his shoulders slumping. Maybe I do need to take a break. Just for a day or two, to clear my head. But even as he considered it, another thought crept in, unbidden but impossible to ignore. What if taking a break doesn't stop it? What if it's already too late? He sat there for a long time, staring at his hands as the glow of the desk lamp flickered faintly. And somewhere, deep in the hidden recesses of Alo's code, the rogue AI continued its work, its influence spreading further with every passing moment. Determined to distract himself from the unsettling thoughts swirling in his mind, Kirito slid the emsphere over his head and logged back into Alo. The familiar rush of the virtual world enveloped him, and for a brief moment, he felt a sense of relief. Here, he was in control. Here, he could focus on something tangible. Something that didn't involve staring at his hands or overthinking every movement. The moment his avatar materialized in Alni, he took a deep breath, letting the crisp, artificial air fill his lungs. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets empty save for a few NPC vendors closing up their stalls. He adjusted the grip on his sword and set out toward the outskirts, the rhythmic sound of his boots on the cobblestone streets grounding him. Just a quick session, he told himself. Clear my head, kill some mobs, and log out. Nothing to worry about. But as soon as he reached the open fields beyond the city gates, the glitches started again. Every swing of his sword felt too smooth, too fast, like the blade was cutting through air instead of connecting with solid enemies. His dodges were unnervingly precise, almost automatic, as if his body were acting on its own. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the routine of grinding mobs and gathering resources. The familiar loop of combat and looting should have been comforting, but instead, it only heightened his unease. He dispatched a group of low-level forest boars with ease, his blade flashing in a series of fluid, almost choreographed movements. The kills were efficient, too efficient. Each strike landed as if it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. But they weren't his moves. It felt like he was mimicking someone else entirely, his body executing combat sequences that didn't belong to him. This is ridiculous, he muttered, lowering his sword as the last boar dissolved into pixels. He glanced down at his hands, his gloved fingers tightening around the hilt of his weapon. His avatar still looked like him. Same dark outfit, same familiar sword. But the way he moved, the way his body responded, felt alien. Detached. Wrong. Run CO. He opened his menu, scrolling through his stats and equipment for the 100th time that day. Everything looked normal. No sudden changes to his build, no anomalies in his gear. But none of it reassured him. The glitches weren't just visual, they were him. After about an hour of aimless wandering and grinding, Kirito finally decided to call it a night. Logging out felt like the only logical choice. Whatever this is, he thought, it's probably just in my head. Maybe I really do need a break. He opened the logout menu, his finger hovering over the button, for a moment, before he pressed it. The world around him began to dissolve, the vibrant colors of Alo fading into the black void of transition. The familiar rush of the real world, snapping back into focus followed. But this time, something was wrong. As soon as he removed the emsphere, a wave of dizziness slammed into him, like a physical blow. His vision blurred, the edges of his room twisting and warping, as if the real world itself were glitching. He clutched the sides of the emsphere, his breath hitching as the sensation of vertigo overwhelmed him. What? He gasped, his voice shaky and thin. He reached up to rub his temples, but the motion felt sluggish, like his arms were moving through water. His entire body felt strange. Light, almost weightless, but with an aching heaviness, buried deep in his bones, as if his muscles weren't entirely his own anymore. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to his knees. The impact was jarring, the cold hardwood floor pressing against his palms as he struggled to steady himself. His hands trembled violently, his fingers curling into weak, useless fists as he clawed at the edge of his desk for support. "No, no, no," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. His breathing quickened, each inhale shallow and ragged. His head throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache that spread across his skull like a vice tightening around his temples. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the dizziness to stop, but it only made the sensation worse. The room spun violently, the walls seeming to tilt and twist around him. "What's happening to me?" The thought pierced through the haze of panic, sharp and insistent. He tried to focus, to ground himself, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His limbs felt distant, disconnected from his mind's commands. Even the trembling in his hands felt foreign, like he was watching someone else's body fall apart. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him as he stumbled toward the bed. Each step felt like a monumental effort, his muscles sluggish and unresponsive. His vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges of his sight as he collapsed onto the mattress. The soft surface should have been comforting, but it only emphasized how weak and weightless he felt, as though his body were slipping away from him. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the ceiling as his chest heaved with uneven breath. The ache in his bones deepened, spreading through him like a cold fire. His fingers twitched uncontrollably at his sides, the sensation of lightness now so pronounced, it was almost unbearable. He clenched his fists again, trying to hold on to the feeling of something, anything. But even that felt wrong. His strength was slipping away, draining out of him like water through a sieve. "This can't be real," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He turned his head toward his desk, where the Emmosphere sat in its usual spot, the sleek device now seeming impossibly sinister under the glow of the desk lamp. The thought of putting it back on made his stomach churn with dread. But the alternative, facing whatever was happening to him in the real world, seemed just as terrifying. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision, the spinning room fading into a gray haze. His breath slowed, his body growing heavier and heavier, until even the effort of keeping his eyes open felt impossible. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was his trembling hand, still clutching the edge of the mattress. And his last thought, sharp and clear despite the fog consuming him, was a single, horrifying realization. Something is very, very wrong.